Okay, ladies and gents, we'll make a start. Welcome to King's College. My name's Phil Sabin. I'm Professor of Strategic Studies here in the War Studies Department. So welcome to King's and welcome to the second public lecture of the King's Wargaming Network. The School of Security Studies here at King's has identified wargaming as a priority area to advance the theory and application of wargaming as a method of inquiry and as a method of learning and teaching. For those who don't know, this is very much a boom period for wargaming in the world as a whole. Government officials, think tanks, academics reviving their interest in this technique to understand the requirements for deterrence and defence, to adapt strategy, doctrine and capability in our new era of strategic competition. In 2017, the US government invested $500 million over 5 years in a new program to reinvigorate wargaming. The UK is following suit. We have the publication that same year of a wargaming handbook by the Concepts and Doctrine Centre of the Ministry of Defence, a new wargaming centre for excellence established within Defence Science and Technology Labs, a new office of strategic net assessment within the Ministry of Defence, which will employ wargaming techniques, and the people who are leading up those are all present here today. Our Wargaming Network tries to engage and to convene world-class wargaming scholars, practitioners and emerging talent. Just this afternoon we launched a new academic wargaming working group. It includes leading scholars employing wargaming as a method of inquiry and studying wargaming, and brought together scholars, about 15 of us, from Oxford, Brown University, Naval War College, National Defence University, Naval Postgraduate School, Berkeley in California, and of course here at King's and other places. King's is the leading centre, I think, for civilian wargaming research and education, certainly here in the UK. We've got a rich history of activities in this respect. Since 2003, I myself have taught an MA option course, and including to some of you here today, and I employ wargaming in teaching history of conflict to BA students. Since 2013, the department has co-organised with Defence Science and Technology Labs and with the UK Defence Academy the premier annual European Professional Wargaming Conference, Connections UK, and you can find the proceedings of that online if you would like to see the sort of thing that we do. Since 2015, Ivanka Barzashka, who's my co-director of the King's Wargaming Network, has led the development of a new strategic gaming method. She's directed a series of high-profile gaming events at the UK Defence Academy as part of a 3-year project on understanding the impact of missile defence on nuclear deterrence and stability. The project was successful in the first round of highly competitive grants from the Carnegie Corporation of New York's Disruptive Technologies Initiative. In 2018, my colleague Maggie Hurst, who you'll be hearing from very shortly, won a Leverhulme Fellowship and a British Academy grant for her Pedagogy of Play project, and she's writing a book for Oxford University Press. In 2018, Heather Williams and Professor Lawrence Friedman got a grant from the US DoD to research the impact of social media on nuclear signalling, including a wargaming component. And Professor Wynne Bowen, the head of our faculty, and Matt Moran recently developed a deterrence project, again using wargaming to examine, for example, chemical weapons use in Syria. So there's a hell of a lot going on. What we're doing tonight is hosting, as I said, the second of our public lecture series, following on from Dr. Peter Perler's very popular inaugural lecture just last month. These lectures examine fundamental challenges for adapting wargaming theory and practice to usefully address contemporary security problems facing the UK and its NATO allies. And this evening we're very fortunate indeed to have Dr Yuna Wong join us from RAND to give our second lecture on developing wargaming as an academic discipline. And I'll now hand over to my colleague Dr Maggie Hurst to introduce Yuna and to chair the debate. And we look forward very much to your comments and to your questions as the event proceeds. Thanks very much.
Many thanks, Phil. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. I'm Dr. Maggie Hurst. I'm a lecturer here in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, and I'm delighted to be chairing the event today. We've got the fabulous Dr. Yuna Wong, who is joining us from RAND. Dr. Wong is a policy researcher over at RAND, where she works on a number of wargaming-related projects, primarily for the US Department of Defense. Her experience is extensive. It's included creating and running war games to support the development of national defense strategy, using war games to explore potential escalatory developments and dynamics with the introduction of artificial intelligence and unmanned systems, and also wargaming recommendations for the US Marine Corps. She was the co-chair of the 2016 and also the 2017 Military Operations Research Society, known as MORS, of their special meetings on war games. She's run panels on topics such as red teaming and the psychology of wargaming as well. She's also an organizer and a frequent contributor to the US Connections Wargaming Conference series. She did her PhD at RAND, I believe, also. And without further ado, I will pass over to her to talk to us this evening about the question of establishing an academic discipline of wargaming. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for having me. It's quite a privilege to be asked to speak. And it's amazing that after Peter Perlow you're asking me, so that's also quite a privilege. Thank you all for coming. My children are very excited because YouTube is involved. So a few years ago, I was telling my youngest, so they're both teenagers now, but I was telling my youngest, what I do, and he looked kind of interested because gaming was involved, and then he found out it was with board games, and he recoils and yells, "Not cool, Mom, not cool." So I think this has helped sort of reduce the not cool factor a little bit in his eyes. So I'm going to be talking, and I apologize because my context is primarily the U.S. defense wargaming community, and it's primarily the U.S. academic perspectives. So I imagine it's not quite the perspectives that might be here. So, but that's sort of the body of my experience, and that's what I'll be speaking with. So, why do we need an academic discipline for wargaming? So I'm going to talk first about a little bit about what's going on in U.S. defense circles and some of us who've been organizing on that topic. And then we're going to talk about the underlying reasons for that. So 2011 was my first Connections Wargaming conference in Washington, D.C., and it was at National Defense University. And so before that, I had no idea that dice came in more than 6 sides. So but I was involved in a project where I was actually a defense analyst. So I was part of the government. So I was a civilian analyst for the U.S. Marine Corps, working in Quantico, and I was supposed to oversee this war game. And it was run by Peter Perlow, who I knew was the name to go to in wargaming, but I didn't know a lot about wargaming beyond that. So I'm at my first Connections conference, and I'm watching sort of. It's fascinating. There are a lot of middle-aged men hunched over in baseball caps rolling dice and moving miniatures, right? And I had the strangest feeling that I had suddenly come home and these were my people. So then it was like, if these are my people, what is it that they do? So I had to learn all of this language of hex games and card-driven games because I had spent my youth sort of studying, right? So I've never used Maxwell's equations, but I wish I had done Dungeons and Dragons because the Dungeon Master function, it turns out, would have been helpful in my current job. So it was sort of a process for me to learn, how do you pick up these skills? And the problem I was seeing was people had gone into defense wargaming because they spent their youth playing games, a bunch of board games, Avalon Hill games, right? And the way to legitimize yourself in front of that crowd was to put up the slide of your actual games that you played when you were in high school. Or you could quote Peter Perlow, or you could put up the table of the Prussian miniatures game from the 19th century to establish your sort of historical knowledge of the field and therefore be someone who you could listen to. So I did the easiest thing, which is quote Peter Perlow, right? And then I started having game day at my house, and I would just sort of watch, right? So if I'd missed, this sort of period in my, adolescence, right? If that's how I should have been spending my adolescence, well, how am I supposed to catch up now? So 2012 to 2014 also. So I go, well, how else do you learn besides having spent your youth, which there's nothing to be done about that now, right? My wasted youth, I can't do anything about that now. So, well, how else have I learned, right? I've gone to a lot of graduate degree programs, right? I think I have 5 degrees, right? I would have more if they were cheaper, but that is what I've done with my life. So I started emailing people and go, well, what would a master's in gaming look like? And that seemed to trigger quite a reaction. So we were coming up with these lists of dream classes, like, well, you need one on statistics, right? I don't think we even have a good article on the statistics of wargaming, talking about Bayesian versus frequentist approaches, right? A lot of the dice throwing games are frequentist, but for some types of topics where you don't know the probabilities, you want to use more of a Bayesian approach. And I think matrix gaming, for those of you who are familiar, is a little bit more Bayesian in its orientation. But we don't have a really good article even on what sort of orientation should have with probability in games and when to use what. Now, people talked about, well, you need sort of quantitative analyses because there's some demand for, sometimes in the US defense community, the interaction of war games with models and simulations. Well, you need qualitative analysis because a lot of this is narrative, a lot of this is what people call story living, right? So, but immediately you run into the problem where people have layman's terms for phenomena in wargaming, but we haven't really connected it to appropriate academic literature. They were like, well, there should be a practicum on designing it. There should be this. There should be that. So that's how it sort of started. So December 2014, we actually held a meeting, several of us, and these are several of us that have been involved with MORS, involved with connections. So I tried to include who I thought were the major sort of stakeholders sort of in this community, and we had a meeting, and we talked about wargaming education. This was December 2014. Is that, well, we decided there were several audiences, right? So wargaming we were seeing it trending again. So Peter Perloff, who I think spoke, he says he's seen sort of every 10 years it seems to sort of come into fashion and out again, which is better than counterinsurgency, which seems to be maybe 40 years. So if you're looking for a new job, it seemed wargaming was the way to go. But so first of all, there's a general audience who wants to understand something about games and who may use them. The second audience are practitioners who need to put on war games. And then the third is an academic audience who wants to study it in its own right. And then so as a community, we had to talk about it because there's a scarce resource, right? There were a few people who have academic credentials and wargaming credentials, and you have a large amount of demand that we could see sort of coming for this. So what were the options? There was continuing education, which we could do. There was sort of professional education for practitioners. That idea eventually became the MORS, the Military Operations Research Society certificate program in wargaming, and there was an academic degree. There was a significant demand among those in the room for an academic degree because they felt it would be able to do things that simply continuing education or practitioner-based education was not going to be sufficient for. That was, again, December 2014. So early February 2015, Deputy Secretary of Defense Bob Work sends out the memo on wargaming and innovation, announcing new wargaming efforts. So there was an immediate surge in demand, and we talked about the MORS Wargaming Certificate Program. So great, find out resources in the community to sort of generate new expertise in wargaming, and that's where a lot of attention for a few years went. Also mid-February, so recently, right after that, those of us who were interested in organizing an academic degree program actually had a meeting with one of the universities in the Washington D.C. metro area. So that it was a dean at the College of Visual and Performing Arts for the school, and he said yes to a Master's of Fine Arts in Gaming Studies. And then he says, right, so the meeting went incredibly well. We talked about how it would be interdisciplinary, and he says these magical words that are still magical to me because we still have to do this. And he says casually, oh, you'll eventually want your own PhD students too. So very exciting for us. We tell people, I'm starting to get emails and saying, hey, when is this MFA coming online? Can I come? Hey, can you create a PhD program, and can you make a distance because I really want a PhD in wargaming, but I don't live in the area. But unfortunately, by 2016, there was a new dean who we didn't know. The fiscal environment for this university had changed quite a bit, so they were in less of a position to take risks with new programs. And the direction looked like it was going to digital gaming instead of something what we were trying to aim for. No, but 2017 and 2018, we're in discussions. We haven't given up because I've told people, as long as I'm alive, we're not going to give up on this. I'm still alive. Right, so we're in discussions with another university in the DC metro area. I think this will go a little bit slower, but hopefully we'll be able to establish something. And this time I won't announce it before we actually have things out. So, but why did this group sort of want wargaming as a graduate degree program so much, right? Why isn't it just enough to train additional wargamers? So there's some practical reasons. So there was no credentialing for wargaming until recently. So people talked a lot about the Moore's certificate program. It seems to have sort of entered a sort of danger zone now, which I think people discussed and sort of foresaw a little bit before, where it said if you come up with a credential, will it actually crowd out the people who were teaching the program? Because now they don't have this credential, but someone with no experience who went through the credentialing process does. And I think I'm even now seeing someone saying, well, if we stand up a new wargaming center, should one of the credentials be you went through the Moore certificate program? Because right now that's sort of the only credentialing out there. It's insufficient, I think, as people will tell you up front. It doesn't produce maybe the skilled and experienced people that you need. It's just a start. The other practical reasons was a perceived lack of legitimacy within DoD compared to other fields such as operations research. There's a lack of a path for creating new wargamers. Like I said, if you didn't spend your youth playing these board games, well, how do you become a wargamer at this point? It has to be distinct from digital games and the whole field of digital gaming studies, which focuses on games that are produced for entertainment. And that's important. It's just not the type of games that we're looking at, which are to inform actual policy and decision making. There's real limits to how much more the funded work through consultancy, right, through the if you were paid to do wargaming, and I make my livelihood this way, full-time consulting about wargaming and putting on wargames, right? I would never have in my wildest dreams, realize that you could actually make a living that way. And my immigrant Asian parents, if they knew that this is what I actually did for a living, I don't know what they'd say. I just haven't told them, right? It's just such not a thing that the child of immigrant Asian parents are supposed to do. So, right, it's all med school and other things, but anyway. So, but we really have real limits to how much that sort of consultancy-based work can do advancing the field, and I'll tell you why. So I have been on the government side before where it was my job to be the sponsor's rep for the game. I've been an analyst on, I've been an observer, I've been on the side putting on the war games, and there's no demand for research. There's a demand to get to the sponsor's questions, write a report that's the 80% solution, right, in a week, as quickly as you can, and then turn it over, and then you're on to the next project. The sponsor doesn't necessarily care about academic work. They want to know what their immediate challenges are, and then they want, they're just, if you have extra room in the budget for time or anything, there are other things to put it to. So, and the other thing is, another reason for wanting it from a practical perspective is, so the sad thing is sort of, if you read some of the accounts of sort of U.S. defense wargaming from 50 years ago, it looks like if those accounts are true, we've lost a lot of skills. Those have simply vanished. And there wasn't a way to sort of perpetuate those skills. I think if you look at, well, I won't name names, but it looks like we've lost a lot of skills. In many defense circles, what counts as wargaming is not much more than a large group with completely unstructured discussion. And sort of that's the extent to which this has been watered down. So, if you had a degree program where people were at least keeping the basics alive, could you have, prevented this, seemingly really bad outcome, perhaps. The other thing is, so there are pockets of continuing knowledge, such as the war colleges, but again, this was really dependent on DoD interests, right? So the U.S. Department of Defense is a very generous sponsor with wargaming, definitely appreciate it, but sustained defense interest is not guaranteed. And also, the contours of defense hiring limits the background of people who enter wargaming. So how do you become a defense wargamer in the U.S. community? It isn't because you had wargaming skills. It's because you had entry into the defense departments in other ways. Like, there were other credentials that they were looking for other than wargaming, and then among who's available and interested, you become wargamers. So that screens out a lot of backgrounds that I think academically and intellectually really belong as well. Another difficult thing are many things are classified or otherwise restricted. All my war games I'm doing for RAND, they're classified. I can't talk to you about them. I've also I've also interviewed a number of wargaming centers about their best practices and methods and tools. and I kept it at the unclassified level, but it looks like combined they'll be restricted. So it's a case where there were allied wargaming centers who sent me information, and I won't be able to send them back anything, so apologies. And also, another thing is there's only so much that full-time practitioners can do on the side in terms of research. So actually, wargaming is a terrible lifestyle. If you're thinking about it, you won't have work-life balance, so think about it carefully. And if you want to add sort of intellectual thought, if you want to add sort of academic research to that, it's really not possible. So what are some of the so those are practical reasons. So what are some of the intellectual reasons? So I think one is there's a real desire to have the intellectual depth and rigor behind what we are doing. So there are people who do in wargaming, and no one gets a degree right now in wargaming, but they have PhDs in other areas. And I think for anyone who has a PhD in another field, there's a real desire to get to that level of intellectual depth and rigor on something that they're working on now and that they believe in, which is a method, which is wargaming. So wargaming is a field that is both theory and practice, right? There are a lot of fields where there's practice and theory, like development, for example. So on the wargaming side, for now, practice is getting better. It definitely could be better, but the theory is really lagging. The backbone of the U.S. defense wargaming communities, they're centered around communities of practice. So there's a literature on communities of practice. If you Google it, you can see they talk about sort of communities of practice and what they are and how they differ from communities of interest. And one of the marks of a successful community of practice is that you know each other well enough and you feel comfortable enough that you pick up the phone and say, hey, how did you do this? Like, I have this problem, how did you handle it? And some of the literature talks about Xerox repairmen, for example, and how it's not passed on through the knowledge of how to repair things is not passed on through manuals, but through this tacit knowledge and this community. So some of that, So some of that has to be formalized, but for right now, the backbone is the communities of practice. So connections, U.S. connections crowd overlaps with the Moore's Military Operations Research Society Community of Practice for Wargaming, which has overlapped with the two special meetings, and that was on purpose. We did it because we did not want the wargaming to be taken over by people who are strictly technical analysts and feel that wargames are poor man's models and simulations. I can say this now, right? So we staffed it with the connections crowd and deliberately sort of shut out some people who were mostly technical. But we didn't say anything at the time. All right. Another thing is we need an intellectually critical record of wargaming. So it was really frustrating while the United States was involved in Iraq and Afghanistan to be reading about Vietnam-era counterinsurgency games. But there's no record of that, right? Well, what did you do, right? What did the game look like? What did it find? How did it compare with some of the other research that was going on, right? What were the limitations? What were the contemporary critiques? Don't know. And another example, I find out there's a war game called the Land Forces War Game played continuously for at least 10 years by the Marines in Quantico, but I'd never heard of it before, right? What did they do? What did they discover? What did they use it for? We don't know. So the U.S. Department of Defense is now putting together a repository, but it's classified. I have to go over to the Pentagon and sit at a particular desk to try to access it. And it's what people put in. It isn't necessarily critique and reflection. Part of this, again, is there is no time for critique and reflection. And another reason is the method, I think, is really ready to break out into other application areas other than defense. I've talked to people who are interested in using it for health. Not just sort of biohazard, health games or bioterrorist attack games, but social determinants of health and other things. I was on part of an application for a grant from the National Institutes of Health in the United States, and the doctors did not understand wargaming and totally slammed it as a method. Could not believe that it would be useful for anything or was legitimate in any way. So I think there's if we had more of a field where people could explain what the method was, perhaps. Or not, I don't know about with doctors, perhaps it might help. So right now, another reason I think another intellectual reason for making it a discipline is right now, wargaming in the United States draws upon several disciplines who are there as a result of accident and history, but are not always the ones that are the intellectually appropriate ones. So and I include my own background in this. So who is part of the U.S. Defense wargaming crowd? Operations research, or I guess it's called operational research in the UK. Another one are the math and science people. So we have wargamers who with statistics, physics, chemistry backgrounds. Military planners. So in some cases where one of the reasons I think the practice and skill set of wargaming has really gone away. Sometimes people show up and because they don't know what else to do, they have a military planning exercise according to sort of planning doctrine, and which they feel suits their purposes. So and another type are the international relations types within political science. So some of my background is in international relations within political science. So I had Kenneth Waltz for international relations, by the way, and I had Thomas Schelling for game theory. So it's not that I don't love, love and appreciate all this, but if you look at the lists that I just mentioned, none of them have academic expertise in individual or small group cognition, learning, interactions. They all have a very positivist lens as well. And sometimes if you're going to use the layman's terms of saying wargaming is about story living, well, what does that look like when you study it, from the post-positivist framework, There are methods, and we don't really look at it from them. So one of the things we did do, for the 2017 Moores Wargaming special meeting, I chaired the psychology panel, and I asked for actual psychologists come and talk about what psychology could bring to wargaming, and I think I found it very interesting. So we sort of, those of us who are established in the field, we play psychologists, but that's really not good enough. There are wargamers with physics backgrounds who try to talk about and apply psychology to wargaming, but if it's not your field, you don't even know if you're applying good theory. Is it irrelevant? Is it sort of decades sort of outdated at this point? And I think that's a very dangerous zone. But we don't have people in the wargaming community who can peer review that. But how much, this is where silent internal scream, There's all this research. None of it's applied to wargaming. Part of it, again, is the hiring practices of who makes it into wargaming and sort of defense analysis. Okay, so wargaming could hugely benefit from the theory and methods already developed in other fields. So we, for example, we have these sort of practitioner topologies of games, Games for learning, games for discovery, but what is the actual mapping if you're going to do cognitive tasks, Describe it to me in academic terms, Is it divergent thinking? Is it convergent thinking? Is it the application of heuristics, Someone knows this, Someone is expert in the language and the theory and the application of cognitive tasks at the individual and small group level and can actually tell me the answer, but I don't know where this person is, And they haven't seen enough defense war games. But they would know, So what individual and small group thinking and processes do you actually have? Do you actually want to have? What group processes are you actually witnessing, Here's another one. Is wargaming actually effective? So I was talking to someone with a background in education about this, and I said, and she goes, well, how do you know? I explained this was a few years ago, and the memo had come out. And they goes, well, how? I said, the Pentagon's about to dump a bunch of money in wargaming. And she goes, well, how do you know it's effective? I said, well, the Navy wargamed in the interwar years, and we won World War II. And she just stares at me, because I don't really have better evidence than this. And some people have pushed back on this, But I think we can do better, and everyone talks about Admiral Nimitz coming back to a Naval War College in 1960, and here's the famous quote. The war with Japan had been reenacted in the game rooms by so many people and in so many different ways that nothing that happened during that war was a surprise, absolutely nothing except the kamikaze tactics towards the end of the war. So, if you've seen Lord of the Rings, history becomes legend, legend became myth, and some things that should have not been forgotten were lost. It's great that we have that quote, but can we do better now in terms of evaluative research on its efficacy? And so it was interesting to talk to this researcher with an education background, because she's saying, this could be an interesting intervention for education. Everyone wants 21st century skills, but no one knows what those are, and no one knows how to teach them. That's great. Made me feel a little bit better, No one actually knows what their own field is demanding in some ways. But can we study it as an intervention? How long does that persist? actually what is it that you're intervening to try to get? And another thing that's really missing are models of organizational learning. So if you want to, we haven't even revisited this great success, right, of the Navy in the interwar years, understanding what the Japanese were trying to do with wargaming, and said, was there a particular organizational model, right? Not only did people wargame, they were sent back to the fleet as commanders, right? So, but there was an organizational learning process that was set up. Like, what was that model? What had to be true about the organization for that learning to actually occur and for the learning to be applied? I think too much of the time, wargamers, when wargamers talk to each other, it's at the wargame design level, because that's the level where they have control, and that's the level that they see, but that's not an effective level to just be looking at if you were talking about organizational learning. So, I mean, does wargaming cause learning and intervention, or do other organizational characteristics cause wargaming and innovation? Is it that the organizations that wargame have greater license, they're able to attract more in terms of the type of thinkers who would be thinking outside the box, right? If you took away wargaming from these organizations, would they be just as innovative because they're innovative for other reasons? How do we understand the quality of what is going on in a war game? I think it's insufficient anymore to say everyone felt it was a good game, the sponsor was pleased. I think one time in the Marine Corps, when I was working for the Marine Corps, I was an observer, and this colonel was really proud to put on this game, and he was like fishing heavily for compliments, right? I did not really think that design-wise the game was good, but he was really fishing heavily for compliments, so I said, the general seemed pleased, and he took that as the best compliment, right? But I think we owe it to the sponsors. We owe it to people who, if we're going to take a lot of the time to have them come to war games, if we're going to ask sponsors for all this funding to put on war games, is it really, are we doing it to the best of our ability? Is it as effective as what's the evidence, right? We do need to be more evidence-based. Or other things that are not as costly, as time-consuming, and as complicated as wargaming, more effective for some of their purposes. And we'll go into that as well, right? They're related methods, and sometimes those are good substitutes for sponsors. And I think we need to talk about those as well. Okay. So, what disciplines should be involved in wargaming? And again, my apologies. This is sort of the way my understanding of the U.S. disciplines. Again, not necessarily the way some of these disciplines break out in other countries. And you also have to remember how heavily quantitative U.S. social science is in general. So psychology, right? There are all sorts of areas of psychology that we should be drawing from, right? Developmental psychology. There's a literature on play and learning among children, which is fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating, right? People talk about children have a right to play. Play is the work of childhood because children learn faster than adults. They integrate a lot of things in their play. There's play-based therapy. There's play-based means of teaching children with autism, social reasoning, and there's a huge literature on that. And I think we should not underestimate sort of how strong that tool is, learning through play, and how naturally it comes to us. And if you think about human life, and other people have commented on how long childhood is for humans in the lifespan, right? We spend a lot of that learning, and a lot of that learning is through play. Well, what about adult play? Like, why do adults play? What's the purpose of adult play? What does that mean for adult education? What does that mean for wargaming, right? What is the generalizability of play-based anything for other populations, right? If experimenting on college students can give you an idea about the efficacy of gaming as an intervention and study how persistent that is, what does that apply to adults, right? We don't actually. I don't know. So, someone knows, right? I don't know. Industrial and organizational psychology, educational psychology, experimental and research psychology, social psychology, military psychology, sociology, right? Education, applied anthropology, brain and cognitive sciences, right? You talk to sociologists, they said, well, what you're doing sounds like, there's this thing called embodied cognition, where if you sort of dress up as a part, you'll start to sort of role play. We don't even have, in the wargaming community, we don't even have the language, whereas there are entire disciplines where this has been their focus. right? And someone from psychiatry even told me, well, there's a role of emotion in coding during learning, right? So if your emotions, right, if affect is involved, you'll code an emotion with what you've learned, and you will retain that better. So, what does that mean for war games as well? But again, these are entire disciplines that are missing. And sometimes it feels harsh to say, we are not enough. But I think there's lots to be learned from other people. Another reason is we need to watch for negative outcomes, right? So negative outcomes like over-learning from one game, or negative learning, like you learned the wrong lesson, right? There were biases in the assumptions, and you took away a completely wrong set of lessons from this. But we don't really study that. Part of it is there's a lot of incentive to say, that was a great war game. We got a lot out of it. Thank you all for coming. No one believes, right? No one wants to believe that their war game contributed to the problem. So wargaming needs to be in better concert with related methods at a research level. We can talk about problem structuring methods in operational research. So I think this is an old line of reasoning, but if you go back to 1992, Rosenhead, who was the chair of the operational research department at London School of Economics, starts publishing on problem structuring methods, which is a qualitative way of trying to get stakeholders to discuss the problem. So sort of non-traditional operational research. There's a line of thinking from there. You could go back to the Journal of the Operational Research Society from 1977 and trace that. So problem structuring methods have kind of made a resurgence, and the continental Europeans, operational analysts, sorry for the redundancy, call it judgment-based methods, and the NATO SAS panel published something on judgment-based methods. So sometimes problem structuring methods are a very good substitute for war games. They're significantly less complex, and they're significantly less sort of demanding to put on. And sometimes that's really what the sponsor wants and needs, and not, right, wargaming with hex encounters and other things. But we haven't had a really good discussion in that, right? Other things, right? Narrative analysis, other discussions with futures methods. Because wargaming is a futures method, but we've not sort of been talking to other futures methods people at the academic level. And then design thinking. So this is one I want to present on. I'm going to try to present on at the next U.S. Connections Wargaming Conference. So design thinking comes. IDEO in the 1990s published a book on design thinking and sort of popularized it in the United States. So there's a Stanford design school. MIT has courses on edX.org on design thinking. So it's a iterative design process where you're in this constant sort of test, revise sort of loop, and you can use it for wargame design. So this is where nobody on the team had designed a war game before, but if you set up that design thinking methodology, you can get people who are domain experts to build a game. So I want to talk about that, right? But we've not really had, even from that sort of practice, we haven't really had good contacts or communications there. And I think the demand for wargaming is part of a broader push towards demand for more critical thinking and metacognitive skills. Now, some of this is changes in the broader economy that we are all sort of responding to. I think lately we've all seen the divergence of people who have the educational background for this sort of knowledge-based economy, and what happens if you don't, sort of the divergence and the results of that. My youngest did tell me last year that school is just an industrial process that kills creativity. So no, he's not learning his Latin roots, and he doesn't care what grade he gets in English. I couldn't really argue with him. In the defense community, this is also, right, there's also concern about critical thinking and metacognitive skills. Some of that is there's just greater strategic uncertainty for the United States since the end of the Cold War. What that means, if you're a rank and file defense analyst, is you've gone from terrorism to counterinsurgency to like robots with AI, and it is not trivial to pick up these knowledge domains and try to keep up with the needs of the department. But there is a lot of concern. There's a lot of concern about critical thinking in the operating forces, right? There's just reams and reams written about that. So it's a sign of the demand for more critical thinking and metacognitive skills. So how are we doing on time? Okay. What concrete steps can we take in the short and medium terms to establish such a discipline? Okay, I think one is to take practical steps to recruit other disciplines. Again, we talked about the 2017 Moore's Wargaming special meeting where he had a psychology panel. They talked about what psychology can contribute to wargaming. So for the U.S. Defense Department, it's easier to get psychologists connected to wargaming. So the rise of modern psychology in the United States was actually linked to the Defense Department and World War I. That is when a large number of people entered the U.S. military, which had been quite small before, and they had to figure out a way of matching people to skill sets, and people attribute the rise of modern psychology first to that. And at the end of World War II, I think 1 in every 4 members of the American Psychological Association identified as military psychologists. So, and military psychology is one of the established divisions of the American Psychological Association. So the Defense Department and the psychology community have a long relationship, and then they work in areas such as training and others. So it is actually not that much of a stretch to get psychology, I think, in, and it would be great to have more of them. So I think psychology, bringing psychology, and at least in U.S. defense wargaming circles, is sort of low-hanging fruit. And I think another thing is bringing other disciplines and application areas into the wargaming communities of practice and informal wargaming circles. But yes, and better coordinated effort to outreach to academics who are sort of gaining with their students. Also, we really should attend conferences like in-groups of professional society for those who are studying groups. I don't think anyone from the defense wargaming community overlaps with in-group, and I think eventually we'll sort of need to go there as well. So what obstacles might we face in this endeavor? Well, there are a lot of obstacles, right? I could spend all night on this, but I'll make myself depressed. So limitations on the practitioner side, sort of in the U.S. wargaming side, there's really the dominance of the defense wargaming. It's the domain expertise related connected to wargaming is just overwhelmingly defense. I think even if classifications weren't an issue, right, it is so targeted to defense that it's incomprehensible and not very useful outside that domain. Also, the qualifications to become a practicing wargamer are different than those that are required for research on wargaming. So right now, there has been a resurgence of, so there are actual jobs now in wargaming, which always a surprise to me. But it's people want to see experience in wargaming, but that's right. So they want to know that you helped put on these events, but that's different from can you be an academic researcher. And it's very different from can you bring an entire new set of lenses to the problem. Limitations on the academic side. So. Explaining the defense context to people who have mostly spent their life in academia is, I think, nearly impossible. You could be so I've tried for other contexts. So when we were really interested in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism, you go to experts who are in academia, and you can just spend years of your life trying to explain, and they won't understand about the U.S. Department of Defense, which is just this huge and vast and sprawling thing. And every time you peel back a layer of the onion, it's bigger on the inside. So I think I had a summer job during college at the Pentagon, and I'm still discovering entirely new communities of people that I didn't know existed, let alone evidently are trying to take over the world. But so that's really hard to explain. So I think a lot of the times you had to explain, no, the people in the Defense Department you're going to go see, right? They don't make decisions about whether or not they're going to invade Iraq or not, and it doesn't matter if it was a good idea or not. That's not the problems that they're trying to solve. But to people from the outside, it looks like a unitary actor. And the level of organizational context you need to sort of make any kind of sense or to make sense of what the Defense Department is doing is just not trivial. Should not be underestimated. Again, also on the academic side, tenure track positions are harder and harder to come by in the United States. A lot of the teaching is done by adjuncts. Can you build an academic field based on adjuncts? I don't know. New academic programs are also truly hard to come by as well. The defense war colleges and academic institutions, they have a lot of competing demands. So you might think that some of the research could be done in those places, but I think there are also a number of constraints that they're facing and organizational priorities besides wargaming. And then the question is, who is even qualified to teach? So in our sort of fantasy, this is our list of classes we'd like to have. One of them was teaching facilitation skills. Who in the wargaming community has the proper credentials in facilitation and wargaming? Like, we can't find one, right? So who, so some of this has to be developed over time. Challenges. Another thing is there are challenges to incorporating the technological change that's happening in commercial gaming to defense wargaming. There's a reluctance in the current practitioner base to incorporate technology. Some of that is because of their particular allergies with the modeling and simulation crowd that sort of they felt was trying to strangle defense wargaming. And again, the defense wargamers are sensitive to lectures about, well, a wargame is just one run of a Monte Carlo simulation, because it's not, because you actually don't know how the thing varies at all. There's learning, right? And there's learning between games, right? This is also another set of challenges I didn't even mention, right? So you show up with games. Okay, we'll have one game with the base kit that whoever the set of military operators will have, and then we'll add this like extra widget that will with whatever magical powers, right? And then we'll see, well, how do you account for learning how much of the effect was due to the new widget? How much of the effect was due to the players actually understand the game now? And then if you give them enough time, does the adversary find a way to defeat the new widget, right? But those are all more problems. Sorry, don't mean to get really emotional. I'll go on to the next topic. Okay, so there is a reluctance to incorporate technology. Some of it is cost, some of it is practicality, right? People look at the commercial gaming and go, I want that, right? That looks cool. We need to keep up. Well, some of those commercial games have millions of players, and the cash flow that goes along with having millions of players. And if you are the Department of Defense and you want to run this game once and you have this budget, it makes no sense for you to build this incredible technology. You should do it on the cheap with pieces of paper, because you're not going to run it a million times. Anyway, that's okay. But there really are changes in commercial gaming, and there's the demand for digital tools, and somehow this practitioner community does need to find a way to keep up, because otherwise they're perceived as really lagging, and perceived as lagging and lacking sort of legitimacy in where gaming has gone. And there are some generational aspects to that. Okay. Another thing that is both, I think, a challenge and an opportunity are the changes to undergraduate and graduate education in the United States. So there's a demand for more practical degrees, especially at the undergraduate level. The way the U.S. Academic markets are set up, it can cost quite a bit of money. So there's people cutting back on humanities programs. English programs are in danger or being renamed other things. Political science is no longer a sure thing either. There's need for some of those traditional departments like history, right? There's some colleges that are doing away with history degrees. So there's a lot of pressure for these academic departments to show skills and relevancy, and can people find jobs afterwards? At the graduate level, there's a demand for interdisciplinary degrees. There are also, I think, opportunities to pair wargaming skills with other group facilitation methods to push, to help organizations with creative and critical thinking skills. I think if you frame wargaming as one of the group methods to do critical and creative thinking for your organization, right? I think that puts it on better footing in terms of marketing it as a useful degree, and also it does put it better in better conversation with some of those near methods that we really should be talking about. And I think that was all I had. So I'll open it up now for any questions.
Great, thank you very much.
My name is Ian Mitchell. I'm currently the head of modelling integrity within a government department, so looking at the quality assurance of models, well away from defence. I have worked in defence actually using wargames as analytical tools, and I've been struck how your emphasis on operational research or operations research does seem to suggest an area where wargaming could fit. It certainly did in 1964 when the first professor of operational research in this country, Pat Rivett, who was also the president of the Operational Research Society, as was Jonathan Rosenhead some years later, actually took cameras for BBC television to West Byfleet and showed them how the wargame that was run there worked in conjunction with Professor Ronnie Shepherd, who was the Professor of Military Operational Research at Trivenham. So it has been there, and I think on our side it's very much embedded. Mm-hmm. But I have been struck how much the problem structuring methods echo that, and I would ask that you might consider the strategic choice approach that John Friend introduced as perhaps one of the meta models for gaming. But I think they definitely have the potential to move out of defence, as even H.G. Wells recognised with his other little book. Little Wars is very well known, but he also did floor games, which is how to do very unstructured games looking at societies. So I would commend your efforts to get this embedded somewhere in academia, because I thought otherwise things can fade from view as the personalities that led them also fade from view. So I suppose my question for you would be, would you see organisations like the Operational Research Society and Informs as perhaps places where you can get a fora for these multiple interests by running sessions?
I think to some extent wargaming has become part. So it's there are a particular set of sensitivities with the defense wargaming community and its relations with operations research. I have seen people start fights in meetings, and people get fired from projects as a result of those fights. Sort of that's how sort of passionately people are can be sensitive about it. You know, I think rationally there is no contradiction between using both, and many people will say it. I think the current generation of defense wargamers has had a bad experience with operations research sort of trying to demote them and are sort of not in a mood to be a little brother to optimization techniques anymore. So it's not that it's, and then I think the U.S. defense community is less familiar with problem structuring methods, which I think is a shame. And I think it is something that they should be looking more at. So I'm not sure what my answer is. So yes, you're right, I guess.
Okay, John Curry. It was fascinating you asked, you tackled the sacred cow. Was wargaming actually effective? I particularly like the War Office, the British War Office rules prior to World War I, which had rules for charging machine guns and cavalry from the front. I wonder what impact that had in 1914. Or the first Gulf War, where the RAF was attacking at low level, which turned out to be the wrong tactic. Or I really like the one where the United States Navy carried out a war game, which was a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in 1936. And the after-action review was about how you could do it better. Who was the war game for, I wonder? And I don't know whether the Japanese got hold of the report, but I'm sure they must have tried. The problem is, if you start challenging wargaming, it's hard enough challenging it in the public sector, but how would RAND react to rigorous academic challenges which would say some of the war games were not effective or some of the war games had a negative impact?
I don't know. So I think you have to safely look at really old games, right, that no one cares about anymore, and then maybe you could talk a little bit more about it. But then the disadvantage is those people are gone, so you can't really ask them questions. But I think there are, right, there's a lot of, it is difficult to ask those questions in a contemporary setting. It really is. Yes. So another non-answer.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. My name is Tarek York. I work in the Cabinet Office, where I'm looking at how to use certain types of games to help develop policy, strategic thinking, but also teaching on investigative skills and things like that. How do you see the interplay between, you mentioned simulation and war games. There are other types of games, whether it's card games, board games, small little games that really are less about the theme and more the mechanic. How do you actually see the interplay between all of these? And is that something that you feel would be sort of a key part of the academic study here on war games, is to look at what are the alternatives, such as digital?
I think we owe it to everyone to actually look at alternatives and close cousins and have a better language to describe sort of a better topology of games, right? Depending on the tasks that people are asked to do, rather than either categorizing it by domain or by purpose or by organization. So it would be great if we had just a better language to be able to discuss things like that. I think we're missing that vocabulary. Yes.
Great. There were two questions this side, so I'll switch over here, then we'll return to that side. Thanks.
Hi, John Mason, alumni. You mentioned about domain experts. I wonder to what extent how you manage the if it's an issue, the issue of domain experts in relation to the rules of the game, and also whether you can generate real play if the rules of the game and perhaps the outcome of the game is set by domain experts, the sort of siloed, kind of restrictive game parameters. You talked about how to create interdisciplinarity, but I wonder if in the sort of domain-centric world we live in, whether that's possible. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are a number of challenges. I think about domain expertise, I think people are more forgiving of flaws in game mechanics if the domain expertise and the conversations in that domain are spot on than if they have a great set of mechanics, but the domain expertise is sort of lacking, because when the application is for actual decision making and policy, I think the domain expertise, if if there's ever a trade-off, I think the domain expertise is better. And I think, and actually, you absolutely agree with you that it's difficult in the constraints of things like games when you have a certain fixed, for example, set of resources to run them, to bring in more disciplines than you really need to put on the game and for the immediate purposes. And this is why this is challenging.
Graham Longley-Brown, thanks for a very insightful and honest talk. That was really refreshing, so thank you. My question is, if we can get people into wargaming and make them newbie practitioners, how do we get them across what Phil Pornell will call the journeyman desert, i.e. up to the point where they are expert facilitators, practitioners? Given that, sponsors will always want to turn to the experienced people. How do we get the new guys actually up to that level?
So I think, so Phil and I used to take the bus together and argue this point a lot. But I gave up on public transportation, so I see him less. One point, I do want to talk to the community this summer about design thinking and taking people who are not wargaming designers or experts, but are novices, but are domain experts. And you can create a game with design thinking that's good enough to use. And again, this is why I'm saying that if people will forgive the mechanics a little bit if the domain expertise and the discussion are spot on. So, so I don't know, Phil was just being polite and he's saying, he was backing off a little bit the last time he and I talked about this. But there's this model in the defense wargaming community of the master, game designer, and it's almost like a guild model where you have to spend years an apprentice and then maybe one day you can be Peter Perla, right? And then people have definitions about it, and you have to have design. You have to, to become like a master gamer. People have to pay you to design a number of games across a number of domain areas. And it's like you get points or something, right? And then it's like a game within a game. But I don't think that that's necessary. I think that it is unnecessarily intimidating for people. I think we don't have the luxury of doing that anymore anyway. I think if gaming is going to expand, you need other models of bringing people in, which was the whole, some of the whole point of me having people over and watching them play games, right? And what are they doing? And, can we have a degree program so I can no longer lag so far behind? But I think we can. I think one of the things that I recommend people doing besides getting into the communities of practice is practicing facilitation. So I go to some conferences where I have a prototype. So if you want to innovate, you need prototypes, and you need to be constantly working on your prototypes, and that's very, very difficult, if not impossible, in this sort of consultancy model of funded war games, where you have to show up and you just do that project, and the resources are just for the project. So on my own time, right, I create models of group activities I want to test out, and I go to Connections, and I volunteer to run a group, and I try it out on people, because Connections is free, so I don't feel bad. And then I think, I'm always on the lookout for younger people to involve in wargaming. You have to build some level of experience. I'm sorry, now I'm just rambling. What was your question again?
How do you get those people across the desert?
I would argue that it's not as much of a desert. I would argue that there isn't this linear pinnacle you have to get to. I would say if you have the way I recommend people get into wargaming, I said, establish yourself first in your domain, and then just start to wargame. And congratulations, now you're a wargamer. But again, that domain expertise will trump the sort of design flaws, and you'll learn along the way. But you should establish yourself as a domain expert first, and it's easier to get into it that way. I don't think we need this sort of years-long apprenticeship model. And again, I really want to talk about design thinking, and I think that's kind of a shortcut. And I think I'm sorry, I will be talking about that because I believe very strongly that I disagree with this model.
Jocelyn Spencer, just a layperson, but my educational background is in language learning and teaching. And my master's dissertation dealt with, because I was very struck by you talking about the challenge of showing the ROI, the usefulness, the utility of a wargaming degree. And this was something that my own master's dissertation dealt with from the perspective of learning a language. Mm-hmm. And one thing that I do worry about in kind of academicizing, professionalizing, and commodifying wargaming is that kind of the informal roots of it that you were talking about, the middle-aged guys in baseball caps. And the guild model, which, while inefficient, does have this sort of, I would argue the German desert is not so much a desert so much as getting into educational theory, this zone of proximal development where you are learning from other people and eventually you absorb enough to be able to do it on your own and then teach others. But I worry that, that there might be a challenge in striking the balance between the fun of wargaming, that informal learning community and community of practice, and making it a completely utilitarian, what's the ROI of this? And so what do you think could be done to strike that balance?
We've definitely had discussions about how useful is a degree for people. My comeback was, a master's in international relations in the DC area qualifies you to make copies. So if you're giving out masters in international relations, why not gaming? But no, we do want to have a set of practical skills, and this is where some of the discussion of facilitation and can you get a certificate in facilitation from one of these professional societies as part of this education? Can you have knowledge of problem structuring methods? Can you have knowledge of other, there are a bunch of other methods you could talk about, of course they don't come to mind when I need them to come to mind, but there are a number of other practical methods that you may want to put in. But yes, this is the how much of it should be based on practice versus how much of it can you spend on theory. This was why we got all excited when the dean was talking about your own PhD program, because you can maybe teach more practical skills that are more marketable at the master's level, and then maybe you could have a couple of PhD students who would really focus on some of the theory. That would be very exciting. But yes, and as someone who did the DC thing with a master's degree in international relations and realizing sort of how expensive that degree had been and how much more I needed to just find a job in Washington DC, I feel the pain of that. So we definitely want to make that practical. And I was just being glib when I'm like, master's in IR, so why not? So yes.
And then we'll go to this gentleman. Sorry, sir. Go ahead. That's fine.
Andrew Reddy, UC Berkeley and Lawrence Livermore National Lab. So you mentioned borrowing from other academic fields, and I'm just wondering whether you have any concerns or major pieces of advice for scholars considering science-based applications of wargaming methods, looking at large N, looking at external validity rather than internal validity.
I think that the difficulty with the large N in wargaming is, are you actually measuring the same game multiple times? Right? There's the whole thing about learning between games, who the learning accrues to. Right? So sometimes the learning accrues to the wargamers, right? The white cell, and not actually so much the players. And so if you want to look at organizational learning, sometimes the people to look at are the people who are constantly putting on these games. I think it all depends on what study you're trying to do with a large N. One of the things I worry about modern political science in the United States is they have regression and case studies and game theory, but there are other methods. And I worry too much about the application of regression.
I'm going to take a few questions from the centre area, then we'll turn over here if that's okay.
Thank you. Does it work? No. Yes, okay. My name is Ludwig Jolo from the Swedish Armed Forces. I'm in charge of gaming for peace operation support exercises. In the small description for your lecture, it's mentioned that you're looking for a globally recognized academic field. And so you talked a lot about multidisciplinarity, but not so much about the global dimension. And what I hear more is a US-UK centered discipline, pretty much like IR. But so nothing wrong with that. But from a Swedish perspective, Scandinavian perspective, I'd like to be part of that too. And so I'm wondering how could this be really a global discipline? And second, what could be the role of NATO in making this happen? Thank you.
I would say definitely what I appreciate some of the work coming out of Sweden is there's a Swedish Morphological Society, which I guess the Brits would classify as a problem structuring method. So there's definitely that method. There's also scenario, is it SDA? I can't remember what it stands for, but looking from the morphological field of selecting scenarios between that, which the Swedes have been definitely in the forefront of. So I think those are related methods to wargaming that people need to look at. And I think a great way to combine some of these methods is actually to use something like morphological analysis to create the set of potential scenarios. So one of the problems really with the U.S. defense wargaming community is they do a straight line projection in the wargame. So someone comes to you and says, I need a wargame on this. So you do a straight line projection of the trends. But something like morphological analysis creates this entire field, and then SDA helps you sample a diverse set from that space rather than clustering around some familiar cases. So I think the first conversation to have when you start linking those methods is, what space do you want to look at and why? And have think about scenario sets for wargames rather than a single wargame that you might want to wargame repeatedly. But definitely, I think the Swedish contribution in morphological analysis is really important. So, but I think we need a home in academia somewhere on the U.S. side before we can sort of aspire to bringing in things like morphological analysis.
Yuna, thank you very much. My name's Tim Hume. I work at the UK Ministry of Defence's Development Concepts and Doctrine Centre. Might I posit that there's an additional element that might need looking at? And I think your example of the US Navy during the war is a very pertinent one. Of course, wargaming was very, very important to that, and they grasped it with great elan. However, one of the other factors that was critical to success was they developed a learning culture where they were able to then apply those lessons learned, experiment and feedback, and they adapted and changed their doctrine to deliver success. So is there a need for a further bit, which is how do you inculcate a learning culture? Failing that, do you need a rebrand? Because games are about winning or losing in people's minds, and actually that can divert people's attention away from what is actually the true benefit of the game, which is the learning process throughout it.
I mean, I absolutely agree with that. and my frustration with some of the U.S. defense quoting of Nimitz is that, you know, they don't talk about the organizational learning process that was set up to make the best use of war games, to maximize the benefit from the war games. And I think people feel sometimes there's a tendency to sort of focus on the game design and not ask what is the larger organizational process that the war game is supposed to feed into, and is that larger organizational process, including the culture of learning, is that working? I think the U.S. Navy, you know, there has been a lot of internal criticism that the U.S. Navy has not produced a strategic thinker for years. I was at a Navy talk, I think last year, and so I asked one of the U.S. naval officers, well, what do you think about this criticism that the U.S. Navy doesn't produce strategic thinkers? And he goes, who says that, right? And the other naval officer at the table goes, literally everyone says that. So, you're absolutely right. I mean, and that is so important. But it's, I think for the U.S. Navy in particular, so it's been very strange. So, in the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Marine Corps comes under the U.S. Navy. So I was technically a Department of Navy civilian for 6 years, but the only thing I learned about the U.S. Navy was that they abandoned the Marines at Guadalcanal. Right? That's the lesson the Marines, U.S. Marines, drove into my head. Right? They've forgiven Imperial Japan at this point, but not the U.S. Navy. And then but going back to organizational learning, so I started going to these. There's also like a naval community in DC that features talks with some fairly high-ranking speakers. So I've been going to like sort of educate myself that there is a Navy. Who knew? Like sea control was a thing? I didn't know. Sorry. But one of the things it's really striking to see where the Navy is versus the U.S. Army, and the U.S. Army since World War II has had disasters. Right? Vietnam. Right, the invasion of Iraq, and where they spent years sort of flailing themselves about, could we not have planned better, right? This is where the red teaming school at Leavenworth comes out of, and they have really struggled with how we mislearn. Do we not learn? What does it mean to sort of learn from your mistakes? What does it mean to pivot to something dramatically different? And I would say the U.S. Navy, until the recent experiences with 7th Fleet, I would say the U.S. Navy's disasters have been sort of at the ship level. They have not had to go to war and traumatically learn lessons about what it is to make mistakes until recently, right? They've had problems with 7th Fleet. So it's like, the land forces, the U.S. Army, the U.S. Marine Corps went to war, and then the Navy kind of didn't. And so they still have this carrier model from World War II because they have not experienced disaster, and they have not had to really face what learning goes on or whether or not they have failed to learn, because they're still a little removed from the types of failures that the U.S. land forces have had to grapple with. So I think failure, tremendous failure, right, disaster, public disaster, really forces the issue of organizational learning like it did for the U.S. Army. But the Navy, is it a good thing or a bad thing that they haven't had huge disasters? I know it's a difficult question, and the culture of the U.S. Navy is such that it's oh, by the way, until recently, they could actually order someone on bread and water, which they inherited from the British Navy, which did away with this tradition a long time ago, but the U.S. Navy kept it. So, we can talk about the difficulties of the organizational cultures and learning. So there's a long answer to say you're absolutely right, but sometimes people need a disaster to remind themselves of the importance of organizational learning.
I'm going to take one more question here, then we'll go to this side of the room.
But no one should take that as me wishing disaster on the U.S. Navy.
Shona, I'm a research fellow at King's College London. So, in your talk, you talked a lot about the vocational aspects of wargaming, right, but there's also an epistemic aspect. And if we think about the establishment of academic disciplines which have been traditionally interdisciplinary, like take international relations, for example, two things seem to be at play. One, a crisis of existing disciplines. International relations came up as an academic discipline after the First World War, when existing disciplines have been discredited when it comes to predicting international events. And secondly, you need to come up with your own theory. So, do you foresee a theory of wargaming sometime eventually? And do you think that there is a crisis of existing disciplines at the moment which can facilitate this evolution of wargaming as a separate academic discipline?
That's a very interesting question, and thank you for asking that. First of all, I'm not sure how interdisciplinary international relations actually is, and maybe it's because I'm more familiar with the U.S. Version of it than the UK version. So apologies. Is there a, one of the things I would say is I don't think in the United States that international relations has been a big player in policy. So if you want to talk about crises of sort of not affecting things, I don't think that people listen to political science. I don't think they listen to international relations. And that's the social science discipline that has the most influence with defense policy. But I don't think people are really listening to it. So maybe there is a crisis in the academic discipline no longer having maybe quite the influence that maybe it thought it should have, and maybe that's why there's this space for wargaming. But on the other hand, I think there's also other trends towards everything becoming more professionalized, independent of individual crises that academic departments or fields may be having, right? In addition to the epistemic questions. Everything is becoming more professionalized, I think, and people are trying to professionalize wargaming. So it's also sort of an internal drive, but with part of that professionalization comes the conscious asking of epistemological questions. And I think there's a real desire to do that. So there's one article and one dissertation on the epistemology of wargaming, and that's unfortunately all sort of we have, but people want sort of more of that. I don't know if that's does that answer your question, or do you have a follow-on statement to that? Do you have a follow-on comment?
No.
Okay.
Hi. I'll stand so you can see me. Is this working? Hi, I'm Carrie Lanzo. I'm a master's student in international relations at the London School of Economics, and I attended one of those Washington, D.C. area universities and proceeded to make copies as a federal consultant. You're not wrong.
Sorry.
I got a good laugh out of it, don't worry. So, as I said, I'm a federal consultant for the Department of Homeland Security. And one of the things that I observed, and a confusion that I've had and I've observed, and I wonder if you share, is the rise of the commodification of different types of war games and their cousins in exercises or simulations for other departments, civilian mostly, that don't have a coherent type of methodology or expertise to them. And, I take, for example, the national level exercise, full-scale exercise, that is part of the Department of Homeland Security every 2 years. And I've worked for that exercise, and I've seen the discord. And there's such a high barrier to entry, as you said, to the Department of Defense and that kind of expertise that it can't really be shared by others than the veterans who come out of that and decide to found their own small consultancies in D.C. I'm wondering if you share that fear, or you share that confusion, and what possible path forward you see.
So you are spot on, and what you are seeing is, unfortunately, so the Department of Homeland Security is relatively young compared to the U.S. Department of Defense. I think the Department of Navy has never forgiven the country for putting it underneath another department, I think, but that's a whole other thing. So what you see is a lot of application of things that the Defense Department has done. I think whether it applies or not, there's a tendency to believe that it applies to DHS. And what you are seeing is the sort of collapse of actual practice in wargaming in the Defense Department in terms of actual method, right, where everything is a war game. But there isn't structure, there isn't practice. You're seeing the sort of spreading of that to DHS, unfortunately. This is one of the things I think why the people behind like the wargamers in putting together the MOORS certificate program, wargaming certificate program, feel such urgency, right? Because they call it box that bunch of guys and gals sitting around a table with like no structure. So like that's driving out good wargaming practice, giving wargaming sort of a bad name, and so that's there's been a real focus on getting the practitioner piece of it right or better. That is an uphill battle. I think in the Department of Defense, it's looking a little better. I can't speak for DHS. It's very disheartening to hear that that's going on. I don't know what to do besides this is, do we go back to stressing the practitioner education? But then there's the balance of practitioner, how much do you focus on practitioner education versus how much can you carve out for theory and sort of better long run outcomes. But it is very disheartening to hear that. I don't have a good answer. I wish I did. But now I'm depressed.
Hello, Wing Commander Paul Kendall from the Royal Air Force. You talked a lot about analytical war games where you're trying to get a result, but the other way we use them, of course, is didactic. And I'm just wondering whether you see that as significantly different. Obviously, the things about return on investment and effectiveness is probably different if your outcome is not trying to train somebody to be a wargamer, but trying to train skills and behaviours associated with other things like operational planning and execution.
Yes. There's a large stakeholder set within the wargaming community where their job is wargaming for training and education purposes. And in those cases, right, you have the list of your training or educational objectives, and you need to provide feedback in the end, and the wargame needs to be structured to align with the curriculum. And then it can be run sort of multiple times after you set that up. Speaking as someone who doesn't do it myself, to me it looks a little bit easier. That may not be the opinion of people actually working in the field. But it is an important community and stakeholder set.
Paul Houth. I'm a commercial wargamer and also as part of the Army Reserve as of last year. It's a question, it sort of follows on from the nationality and sort of Graham's question about crossing the desert. I talked at Connections UK a couple of years ago about the games I run in schools and the diversity that you see within the school population taking part in them. And you referenced baseball caps and wargamers. How do you get a more representative wargaming community, or representative of the general population? Looking around the room, we're maybe not that representative. And do you think the games being commissioned actually contribute to the wargame community that you currently have and you're likely to see in the near future?
So one year, Phil Purnell contacts me and says, I have to come to Connections because otherwise there might not be any women that year. So I go, and I think there were 4, so it was statistically not 0, but just close to statistical 0. I don't know about. So that's a question we sort of struggle with. And if you want to just talk just first about like one demographic that, like women. So the reason I think they don't make it into a lot of the operational wargaming is the militaries are heavily male, and then there were few women who sort of came through, and definitely until recently in the United States, right, a lot of the combat roles were sort of, out for them. And the other way people come into wargaming is, again, they spent their childhood with these hex encounter games, replaying like the Battle of Midway, and I think women just tend not to do that. So I think where you see more women is at the strategic level of gaming. So we're going to be doing a war game for NATO, and I looked, and it's mostly by women, right? So it'll be mostly women running this war game. So they enter there. So their domain expertise tends to be more in international relations rather than the operational. I think we had this whole conversation. So Rex Brannon has something up on PAC Sims about women in gaming. I don't know if it's encouraging women to go into gaming is a great lifestyle choice for anyone. I don't know. You may want to think about it. I think it's interesting on the commercial gaming. So Connections was created to increase the connections between commercial gaming and others. And I think the interest in DoD has pushed out the commercial gamers. So I know one commercial gamer who said he stopped going to Connections because there stopped being anything for him. So when the U.S. Department of Defense shows up, it does tend to suck all the oxygen out of the room and make it all about the U.S. Department of Defense. It's just that large. I think we can have a long conversation, and because I think I also want to know what sort of specific groups you're talking about. Sorry.
Thanks very much, Maggie.
Okay, it's a return on investment question, picking up on the lady's point over here. Mark Chappell, I came out of the Army, got hired by a small company called TRW, which got consumed after 3 or 4 years by another large American prime, and I escaped. But there's some crazy people in there, which for someone who'd just come out of the Army, I mean, literally, I was surrounded by rocket scientists, and they were, that's what they were. You talked about design engineering as being one of the disciplines that should be involved, and I was lucky while I did that work to work with people who were doctors and professors of quality functional design, QFD. Have you had any experience of using QFD or seen people using QFD in games design?
I am not familiar with it, and I don't know if the design thinking I'm referring to from the U.S. side is similar to design engineering, so I am not sure.
Yeah, okay, well, I would suggest that using QFD would help to bring out, if you get your customers in and do QFD with them, you've been there, that would bring a lot of the value out.
Okay, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I will have to unfortunately draw the discussion to a close. Please join me in thanking Yuna for the most fabulous talk, and thank you to you for your questions. Yeah, Phil, over to you.
Okay, thanks so much for coming, everybody. Wonderful talk. Thank you so much for that profusion of questions. We had even more than we could fit in. Just a quick commercial before you go. If you're interested in seeing a war game being run, and potentially even taking part in one, a traditional Kriegspiel, 3-room, red, blue, and control team of 1914, the French and Belgian campaign, tomorrow at 1 o'clock in King's. That is going on, and any of you will be most welcome to attend. If you can get into King's, then it's in K607 in the War Studies meetings room. If you can't get into King's, you need to be signed in and taken through. Come to the front entrance, which is just opposite this building, the main entrance of the Strand site of King's, on the south side of the Strand, just opposite the Old Witch, at 12:50. And I will be there, and as long as you don't miss that deadline, I'll get you signed in and take you up. Okay? So 1 o'clock tomorrow, K607. If you need to be signed in, 12:50 tomorrow. Anybody welcome to come. It'll take about 2.5 hours, and I think you might be interested. Okay. Thank you so much for coming. Keep in touch. If you haven't signed up already, you're not getting in, get the details of our events. Make sure that you talk to Anna, the lady there, and she will get you signed up so that you are informed. Thank you so much for coming.